A lot of my clients struggle with pricing real estate here in Toronto, and I don't really blame them. It's very, very confusing. When you buy a share of a stock like Apple, or you buy Bitcoin, or even a car, for example, they're basically commodities, right? Everyone's buying the same thing, and everybody knows the price of said thing at a given time. Well, it's not the same for real estate, right? Because there's no two homes that are exactly the same. And not to mention, each home only has one owner with different financial and life circumstances. So, needless to say, it's very confusing pricing real estate here in Toronto. And in this video, I'll explain exactly why. Well, first off, you can list a home for whatever you want, right? You can list your $1 million house for $1. You can list your $500,000 house for $1 million, right? And whether that's good or bad is up for debate, but it causes a lot of confusion for consumers because, it's like if you list at, let's say, $399 and you really want $500K, a consumer goes, okay, well, or a buyer goes, okay, well, I want to buy your house. I'm giving you $399, but you're not going to accept. Like, what the heck? But then on the flip side, it's like in a free market, you should be able to list your asset at whatever you want. So, up for debate. I won't jump into that in this video, but needless to say, it's confusing for buyers, right? And yes, buyers have access to new tools, new apps like House Sigma, or property.ca, condos.ca. And yeah, the data's actually gotten a lot better over the years. You can look at price history. Some of these apps even have like an AI generated price estimate. But it's probably, if you look at the code, it's probably just like a bunch of if-else statements. But needless to say, the ability to do price analysis for consumers, for buyers, is limited. And even for sellers when you're looking at pricing your home. And realtors have access to way better tools in our system that we pay for, and it allows us as realtors to do crazy in-depth price comparison analysis. And these tools, regular consumers just don't have them. I've bought homes with a realtor when I wasn't licensed years ago, and I had to rely on my realtor. And now that I am a realtor, I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand why you're able to give such specific and accurate price analysis. It's because we have tools and queries that regular consumers don't. Now, whether this should change or will change over the years, that's a separate conversation. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't know. But that's one of the reasons why it's very, very confusing to do a proper price analysis on the consumer side. So yeah, if a seller can list a home at any price, it's very confusing because how do you actually know what their bottom line is? And if you ask them or their realtor, they're probably going to lie anyways, right? So it's very, very confusing to price homes. For example, just last week, I sold a home in downtown Toronto, and there were two identical units, literally one above another, and the insides looked identical. As close, I know I said homes weren't commodities, but these two homes were as close to being commodities as possible. The only difference was one was higher and one was lower. Literally everything else was the same. Well, one seller wanted $500, and the other seller, well, we got it for $465, right? It's because every seller has different financial circumstances. So yeah, you're looking at two different homes, but what the price actually will be for the buyer will be very different. Because think about it, every seller has different financial circumstances, right? Maybe, for example, in a newer building, a seller bought it at a very high price because pre-construction was high, in the COVID years, and they don't want to sell at a loss, right? They're very stubborn in terms of their bottom line. They want to sell higher. Maybe they have a sentimental attachment to that house. Maybe they think that house is worth more than it actually is, so they want a higher price. Or on the flip side, maybe they're bleeding on their mortgage. Maybe they bought 3-4 properties that they can't close on. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe they made a bad investment elsewhere and they need the cash, and therefore their bottom line will actually be much lower. This isn't the case when you're buying Apple stock or when you're buying a car, right? So that's what makes real estate very, very unique. Every house has a unique owner that that has a unique bottom line. And that's why really it's confusing for buyers and even sellers to price real estate, because you really don't know. And again, that's the job of your realtor, to figure out what that bottom line is, try to, get some negotiation going and try to figure out, what exactly is going on and what exactly they're gonna go for. In my experience, the best way to know what a seller will actually sell it for is to actually give a piece of paper with a legitimate offer, because then they'll negotiate back, and based on how much they're willing to come down, that'll give you a good idea. And also there's conversations that happen between the agents that represent the buyer and the seller, and that helps facilitate the transaction as well. So yeah, it's confusing, but there are ways around it, and there are ways to get very, very accurate information. Now, I mentioned the units that were like almost perfect comparables, that were same layout, same exposure, same inside pretty much, even the same appliances. But what about, and that was a building, for example, that was like a perfect rectangle, which means inside the layouts are all pretty much the same. But if you've walked around downtown Toronto or anywhere really, you've noticed some buildings are not perfect rectangles. Some have weird shapes. And the units that have weird shapes are like rounded corners. Well, most likely that means the units inside are not comparable, which means you can't compare apples to apples. You can't necessarily compare a one bedroom with another one bedroom. Because if the building is weird, right? A one bedroom on the 20th floor could be amazing, perfect feng shui layout, perfect view, no wasted space. And then, for example, a one bedroom on a lower floor could have a blocked view, different exposure, the layout's weird, there's no living space, or there's no hallway. This is very, very, very common, so you can't always do a price comparison just off of like, hey, that one bedroom sold for this price, so this one bedroom surely, or like that one is 500 square feet, 600 square feet, this one is the same square footage, so surely, right? There's always variation, and sometimes that's very confusing. Not sometimes, it is very confusing, which is why you have to do your research when doing price analysis. And speaking of the inside and similarities between units, there's a lot of variation because of upgrades, right? Or the condition of the interior. And sometimes photos don't do it justice. Think about when you're buying a car, right? If you just buy the standard car with no upgrades in the inside, well, it's gonna sell at a lower price than if you get crazy leather seats, if you get a massive cup holder, or whatever else you get in a car in terms of interior upgrades. You're gonna be able to sell it or buy it for more, right? If it's nicer on the inside. And with homes, it's no different. You can put 50K of upgrades on a house, right? Hardwood floors, new appliances, blinds, light fixtures, paint, like flooring, all that jazz, right? And that could be worth 50K, whereas another home, exact same layout, was nothing's been done ever since, they got the house, and a tenant has been living there for 10 years, and maybe there's damage on the floors, right? So that's another thing to consider. It is a little tricky to evaluate, but you can do the math, right? You can just figure out how much of the floors cost, how much of the appliances cost, things like that. And another reason why it's tricky is like sometimes you look at the photos of the listings and it's like you get a little catfished, right? Because you look at the photos and then you actually go and view the home in person, which is why you always have to view the home in person. And the home in person looks nothing like the photos, because maybe the seller used photos from years ago before the tenant occupied it, and now the home looks nothing like the photos. So that's a huge price variation. And that's just an example of two homes that are upgraded, not upgraded. So another reason why it's very, very confusing pricing homes. Also on the buy side, what buyers value is completely subjective. And I've worked with so many buyers, probably done thousands of showings, and I'm not as surprised as much as I used to be, but let me tell you, I've been very, very surprised as to what buyers value in terms of property features more than other things. So for example, let's say there's 2 units in a condo. A higher floor unit has a lake view and the bottom one doesn't. Otherwise they're the same unit. Well, a buyer who absolutely must have a lake view might be willing to pay $50K more for this house, even though everything else is the same. Or maybe they really, really need a parking spot, or they really need a condo with a sauna, or they really, really need an N-unit townhouse as opposed to, you know, a center townhouse with neighbors on both sides. Whatever the case may be, that is subjective to the buyer. Some buyers don't care about the view. Some buyers don't care about certain things, right? And that's why it's very, very difficult to price things, because one buyer who really loves, you know, that lake view is gonna raise up the price comparable sales of that unit for everybody else, even though it might not be market, or maybe it is market because they are the market. But you get my point, right? That's why it's very confusing to price homes, and you gotta understand exactly why that is. And this is why when my clients ask me, hey Ichi, how much do you think this home is worth? I tend not to give an exact dollar figure, like, oh, this home is worth $620, for example. I always give a range. Oh, this home is worth between $605 and $635. It's always a range because like I said, what buyers value is subjective, right? If you really want a lake view and you're within budget, you might pay 50, 60, 65K more because you're like, screw it, I really want the lake view, right? So it's always a range. And the other reason why it's always a range is because there's only one buyer and one seller for this specific asset. It's not like millions of people putting in buy orders and millions of people putting in sell orders for Bitcoin or the S&P, right? You're doing a one-to-one transaction with high costs in terms of like taxes and realtor fees and lawyer fees and things like that. Because it's one-to-one, it's a negotiation. So, and I've done so many of these negotiations, either side, for the most part, they can walk away or pay more in terms of like, you know, maybe 5 to 10K, right? The deal is always a range. You can probably buy that house for $620, but if you really like it, you'd probably be able to go up to $630. And same thing on the sell side. Yeah, you know, you could sell it for $630, but if the buyer is hard at $620, you'd probably be able to sell for $620. So there's always that give or take in that negotiation, which is why real estate is always a range, or why I always give price estimates with a range. So that's why it's very, very confusing to price real estate. I hope this video at least helped explain why that is. I'm sure there's a plethora of other reasons as to why real estate is hard to price, especially in Toronto, an ever-changing market like Toronto. You got geopolitical factors like immigration, you got local bylaws, municipal, provincial bylaws in terms of what they can build, permits, things like that. There's always different taxes and regulations and mortgage rules. So all of these things factor into why pricing real estate is very, very difficult. But at the end of the day, it's not impossible, right? We're not doing level 3 investments of like a foreign investment or something like that. That's very subjective and not publicly traded. At the end of the day, it's not impossible to price real estate. It's just tricky, and you gotta know what you're doing. And if you need help navigating this ever-changing Toronto real estate market, feel free to book a call with me in the link below. And that's it for this video. Hope you found it insightful, and we will see you next time.